newsletter, so you needn't worry if you haven't seen this previous one. We also have a YouTube channel. I'm not sure if the videos on the YouTube are public, Antonio, but if you go to the CID Yale account on YouTube, you'll see all of the workshops we have so far. Cool. So give me 1 second. There we go. So today what we're going to do is sort of go over some of the fundamentals, which are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So just to recap a little bit of what we did last week, HTML refers to the structure of your page. And we're going to see how that's done. CSS is the style of your page. So you imagine your HTML is you're building up a wall full of bricks, and then CSS is the styling. So you take a coat of paint and you apply it to those bricks. So together you can do a lot already with HTML and CSS, and you can create sort of visually stunning like web pages just by using these two. But then you can also have JavaScript mixed in with these two. And what JavaScript does is it lets you make your pages interactive. So if you wanted to code up some sort of like cool animation or like a graphic that you can move around and play with, you want to create like a to-do list, or you want to create Google Maps, any sort of interactive experience you can do with JavaScript. So what we're going to be focusing on today is JavaScript, and in particular React, which will help us use JavaScript in a nicer way. So just to sort of get everyone on the same footing, we won't go into like the nitty-gritty of how to write like HTML. We're only going to be sort of using it as we go along, but this is basically what HTML looks like. You have a lot of nested tags. So what I mean by that is you'll notice that you start off by creating some sort of parent tag, which has some, which denotes like what you want to create. So like you want to create a nav bar, for instance. Inside of that, you can put other HTML tags like divs, unordered lists, list items, paragraphs, things like that. So what you're doing here is you're creating this sort of structure where you start off with like one big brick, and then you're putting like small, tinier bricks on top of that. And there are like other analogies out there as well. So basically what you're doing with HTML is you're just figuring out how your web page is going to look. I'm going to move through this stuff a little bit quickly, but please stop me if you have any questions. Antonio and I are also going to be monitoring the chat. Then we come on to CSS, and CSS is, like I said earlier, just a way to style whatever HTML you have. So CSS syntax is a little bit different. So instead of those like greater than or less than signs, the alligator signs, you instead have a lot of curly braces. And within those curly braces, you're going to be writing like stylistic, like style properties, like what's the color of something, what's the width of something, what's the height of something. Whereas with HTML, all you were really doing was stacking all your basic building blocks together. With CSS, you're applying that coat of paint, or you're styling how those building blocks look. So for instance, you'll see here that if we want to style the list item in the nav, then we'd just be able to style it by writing first nav, then list item, and then all the particular sort of like properties that we want along with that. So don't worry if some of this is going over your head, because HTML and CSS is not the focus of this particular workshop, it's JavaScript, but this is just to give everyone a sort of grounding on what all three of these technologies mean. And then finally, we come on to JavaScript. So the syntax, like if you want a visual image, looks a bit like this, where you have like interactive code. So if you have ever written sort of a programming language like C, Python, or you have any sort of exposure to other programming languages, JavaScript is kind of similar. So you have like variables, you can assign things to variables, you can do arithmetic, you can have functions. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do in JavaScript. And then the idea is that you link up all this stuff to your HTML and CSS, and you start getting interactivity that way. So before I move on to this particular slide, any questions on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so far, or the way that these three play together? Awesome. So if that was a bit too fast, let me know. I can always like go back and revise the concept, or maybe you can go through an example. but we'll sort of go through more of the JavaScript part now. So for all three of these, you have a lot of frameworks out there. So in last week's web portfolio workshop, Antonio showed you how you can make basic HTML and CSS web pages, but then you can also make them look really nice by including a framework. So their frameworks are basically libraries that other people have developed that make it easier to work with that technology. So HTML has a few frameworks. CSS has like really famous frameworks like Bootstrap and Material Design. So what those are like ready-made blocks, like you can see in this image right here. So you could have like cards, like nav bars, footers. So the CSS has already been pre-written for you, and all you need to do is like attach it to your HTML. And JavaScript also has a bunch of frameworks too. So they make it easier to work with JavaScript, so you don't have to write nearly as much code. So for instance, like React, Vue, there are lots of other frameworks out there that can help you like quickly make apps. So now I'm going to go into more of what React is in particular. Now that we've covered all the reviewed all the basics about HTML and CSS or how they interplay together. And what React does is something very interesting. It's not just a library of JavaScript code. It's in fact like a different way of writing your app altogether. So what React is a JavaScript framework that lets you write what looks like HTML. By all means, it is HTML with like small differences. And you write it in such a way that your HTML can become like really magically interactive. And if that seems like a wishy-washy definition, don't worry, because we'll get into more of like how that works. But just for now, think of React as a way that you can write lots of HTML, but then sort of like make it into its own like components. Like for instance, if you've ever written HTML, you might have like heading tags or paragraph tags and things like that. But suppose now that you can make your own custom like HTML tags. So that's what React is basically doing. And then you can like add functionality to those tags. So if that didn't make sense, don't worry, because these are all the slides that we're going to go through. And next we'll just start like coding. But before I move on, what questions do you have?
How would one normally install React? I know we're using Code Sandbox today, so we don't need to, but how would you do that?
There are lots of different ways. If remember like how you kind of like installed Bootstrap last time, which was you took this sort of script that Bootstrap provided for you and you put it in your HTML. So you took this link to where Bootstrap is hosted, and then you put it in like in your HTML document. You can install it like that. So React has this sort of CDN URL thing that you can just slap onto your page. And in Code Sandbox, they do it a little differently. They use JavaScript's like specialized tooling systems in order to do that. So if you've ever heard like the words node or like node packages, they do it through there.
Cool.
Any other questions? Great. So lots of different companies use React. Most of the interactive web apps that you've used either use React or some sort of other similar comparable JavaScript framework. So Instagram is nearly completely built in React. Khan Academy is as well. Slack is, Airbnb is. So nearly almost like most of the web apps that you've used that require a high level of interactivity, odds are they've probably been built with React. So it's a really useful skill to learn. So we're going to jump right into it by accessing this Code Sandbox. So what I'm going to do is take this link and put it in the chat. And this is basically a link to a completed example that we're going to dissect and see how it works. So instead of building something from scratch, which can be confusing since we only have an hour and we don't have a lot of time to learn all the syntax, what we're going to do is get an idea for the general flow of code, the general feel of things, and see like how it all comes together. And so hopefully we can drill down into the things that interest us, and all the like other boilerplate and stuff that just like waste time, we can sort of ignore. So I put this link in the chat. So the first thing that we should do is just click that link and open it up in a new tab in our browser. And it's helpful to have a Code Sandbox account already because of this particular thing that I'm about to do, which is forking the sandbox. So what forking means is you take whatever's on the screen here, this sample app, and you're going to fork it and copy it to your own account. And that'll let you save any changes that you make. Without that, it's just going to bug you. So I'm going to, with this open and sign into my Code Sandbox account, I'm going to just create fork. And so it created a copy for me. And so now if you type in anything and you hit Command S to save, or Control S, or just do File Save here, it'll save for you. So thumbs up if you've been able to, 1, access the link, and 2, fork it to your account. And feel free to shout out or put in the chat if you're having any trouble.
Yeah. Hello. Please, I'm having issues trying to find the fork.
So it's a button on the top right of your screen. So here, roughly, if you can see my cursor, it's next to the blue share button, and it says fork next to it. And you need to be logged in order to be able to see this. Any luck?
I'm kind of new to this. I just signed up my account prior to the start of this meeting. I don't know, by copying this, hold on.
So you should also be able to work with it without forking it for now, right?
Yeah, but you just won't be able to save. You'll be able to view the code and everything, but you won't be able to save any changes. So if you like, you can follow along what I do on my screen.
Okay. That works.
Okay, awesome.
I had the same, can you mute? Sorry, I had the same problem, and when I clicked like create sandbox, the fork button showed up after I clicked create sandbox and created a React sandbox.
Gotcha. Are you able to fork mine?
Sorry?
Are you guys in the same room? Maybe you could help him.
No, sorry, Joel and I are in the same room. I just left.
Oh, gotcha. All right, so yeah, like if you maybe follow like this advice of creating the pressing create sandbox first and then creating fork, although it's not a huge deal, you can just follow along with what I'm doing as well. You just won't be able to save if you need to make any changes.
Yes, sorry, I thought you guys had me. Yes, it has worked now. Thanks.
Oh, perfect.
I'm good.
Awesome.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks for that advice. Sweet. So yeah, let's continue. Before we sort of go into the code, because the code can be overwhelming, the first file we'll have open is app.js. But to start, why don't we close out of the app.js file altogether? So we don't see any code and we're not overwhelmed by what's on the screen. Instead, we take what's on the right side and we just like resize it so we can see actually what this app is doing. So what we're going to do is sort of dissect like how this events app was made. So what this app is a way for, it's like a toy app for people to submit ideas that they have for workshops to this website. And these like workshops are sort of ordered from in order of like most recently submitted. And yeah, it's a place to collect ideas and events. So if you've ever had an idea for an events app or something like to sort of connect a community, and React is one way that you could help build out this app. This is one of many ideas you could possibly make. Other things we could have made for this would be like a to-do list, like an interactive map, but we're sticking with an events app for now. So let's see how it works. So on the top, we've got a nav bar. There's a home and an about link, but we haven't really linked it to anything because we don't have any other pages. That's fine. But just to show you that, yeah, there's a nav bar out there, like a traditional website. We've got like some header text. And then we've got these controls in the middle here. So when you're submitting a workshop title, anyone submitting to this website can start by putting in a workshop title. So maybe people want to see more of like a how to train cats workshop. And you can tell more, you can tell us more. So maybe just like blah, blah, blah. And you could submit this as is. You don't need to submit an image. So you can hit submit here and it shows up on the bottom, right? How to train cats, blah, blah, blah. It also tells you like what time you submitted it at. And then suppose you do want to include an image. So what we can do is just go to Google Images, find an image of a cat, take the maybe the first one or the second one, say we just copy the image link. So your image link should end, which should start with HTTP, whatever image you choose, and should end with a valid extension like PNG, JPEG, so on and so forth. So once you take any image from Google Images and you just like click out of the input, it automatically updates with the preview, right? And now you can click submit and it's able to submit. So just thinking about like how this app works, thinking through the interactions, doing something like this in regular JavaScript is kind of difficult. Because if you've ever used it, if you've ever used JavaScript in HTML before, the traditional flow is to just sort of attach IDs to each HTML element and sort of pull the information and then sort of create like a new div and inject like images and stuff into that. So it can be quite tedious. But what we're going to do like through the rest of the time we have is figure out like how exactly all of this is working. What are the special like features that React provides in order to make this possible? But before we move on, what questions do you have? Have you encountered any trouble? Yeah, have you been able to get this demo working?
Yeah. So Sarim, I think I now have Hello's Code Sandbox page displayed on my screen. I don't know how to navigate that, get past that to where you are.
So maybe you can go into the chat for Zoom, and I've put a link there, and just try clicking that link, and you should see like the code.
Yes. Okay. Got it now.
Sweet. Cool. Yeah. Feel free to play around with the demo on the right, and yeah, see if it works for you.
Okay. All right. It works.
Awesome.
Thanks.
So yeah, any other questions? Sweet. So great. Now that we have this sort of idea of what we're trying to build on the right, let's sort of see what the code looks like in order to do that. So I still don't have any code open right now. If you do have it, just close out of it, like close that tab, because we're going to go through all this folder structure on the left first, and then sort of go into the code. So I'm going to try and ease you into like how everything sort of works. So ignore package.json or like JSON. That's sort of boilerplate that we don't need to worry about right now with the time that we have. You can ignore the public folder and everything inside of it for now as well. And you can ignore this index.js file too. That's totally fine. So really the only thing that we need to worry about right now is this components folder, which has a bunch of stuff inside of it, which we'll come to. This app.js file, and this sort of special thing that Antonio created for us that we'll get into like a bit later. So this is what we're dealing with really, just our components folder, which has some stuff inside of it, an app.js file, and an antonio.css file. So the entry point of any React app is the app.js file. And it's based, why do we call it app.js? No particular reason. You could call it whatever you wanted. You could call it like hello.js or something, but it's sort of like good practice to call the main sort of container for everything to be app.js. So it's like the start of everything for your app. So we put everything in our app.js file. Also, if this text size is too small, I can also increase it for if people are having trouble reading. You can do the same if you're having trouble by just pressing Control if you're on Windows or Command if you're on Mac, and just hitting the plus sign, or just going into View, or it must be here somewhere. I don't know what the toolbar thing is, but you can zoom in and out just by doing Control minus Control plus. Cool. So now that we have app.js open, we don't want to get into what everything is doing immediately because it can get overwhelming. So if you go to where these line numbers are, so you'll see that the first line number says import navbar from components navbar. So you can see that each line has a line number. So what we're going to do is actually go to where it says line number 14, and you'll see this like checkbox, right? This like minimize button. So you're going to minimize this particular function. So we don't actually see what that function is doing. We're just going to ignore it for now. So do that, and then go to line 24, click minimize there too. Go to line 30, minimize 47 as well. So what we've done is we've minimized all these like functions, like all these things that are providing some sort of functionality. We'll get to those later. This is like the interactive portion of our React app. For now, what we're interested in is just everything from line 51 onwards, like everything in this return. Okay. So thumbs up if you've been able to get to this point where you've minimized all those things that are potentially confusing. Cool. So if you've been able to do that, all the sort of complexity that you need to worry about right now is between line 51 and line 75. And that's the stuff we're going to be talking about. So as some of you may know, most HTML is written with tags, right? So you have like a div tag, or you might have like certain tags like paragraphs. So let's sort of look at what I mean by that. So I can enter like a paragraph tag right here, and I can say hello, right? You can try that. So now that you've entered a paragraph tag, you see that it's above the navbar tag. So it'll appear at the top of the page. So you can substitute your tag with, instead of P, you could write an H1, and that works too. So what H1 means is like a heading of size 1, like the largest size. There's also H2, H3, H4, and so on and so forth. Right? And you'll notice that as you edit things, the preview is going to update on the right. If you have stuff incomplete, or if you have some sort of syntax error where tags don't match up, it's going to tell you. But don't be freaked out when you see that error. It's just trying to help you fix it. Right? So now that we know that there are different sorts of tags available in your code editor, it's interesting to see that there are these like special tags out there as well. Like, where did navbar come from? What's spacer mean? What's controls? And what's like all this stuff happening here? So through the remainder of our time, what we're going to do is sort of work through each of these things, right? So navbar, spacer, controls, and then this like workshop cards. So if I want to like create a navbar in regular HTML and CSS, how might I do that without React? So let me comment out navbar for now. And to comment out something in Code Sandbox, just go to the line you want to comment and just press Control/, or if you're on macOS, Command/, like this. Command/ or Control/. It's going to comment it out for you. And when I comment it out and hit save, the navbar is no longer going to be in my preview on the right side. Okay, so if I want to create a navbar by myself, how might I do that? I'll probably start writing some kind of HTML and CSS. So I might have an empty div to begin with, and then inside of that, I might have some heading text, and I might say that's like CID workshops app or something like that. And then I want some links on the right side too. So I might say, oh, this is the about page, or this is the home page. And so I'm just writing a variety of different tags. Now, in this case, it looks a bit ugly where the CID workshops app is on the top and then about is on the bottom. So I might write some CSS to fix that. So just off the top of my head, it's like you may not know this already, but that's fine because this isn't like a CSS kind of workshop. It's mostly just for us to sort of see what React offers us. But you might use something like display flex to put everything on one line. Right, so now everything's on one line, but the sort of vertical alignment is off. So what we can do is just say align items center. And now we have everything in one line. They're too close together here. So there's CID workshops app but about page is hugging it like just they're right next to each other. So we want to create some separation. We can just say justify content space between or space around. Right, so with that, I've got my CID Workshops app on the left and my sort of link on the right for this about page. So you don't have to copy this exactly, but just try playing around with, like, you don't need to have the style, but you can just put like an H1 in here and a span in here, or like some other tag that you like. So thumbs up if you've been able to do that, or let me know if you have any questions. So one of the big things for those of you who've already sort of written HTML and CSS is that the way you specify style is very different in React world. If you're coming from a sort of plain HTML, CSS background, you'd usually write style as this sort of like between quotes, and you write stuff like this: display flex, align items center, and so on and so forth. You do it like this. But with React, it's a little bit different because, like I said earlier, React lets you write HTML, things that look like HTML, but it's not exactly HTML. So instead, we just encapsulate stuff in the style object, but don't worry about it too much. Cool. So now you'll see that now that I've written out this navbar here, in this like sort of front page, you can see that's made stuff a little bit messy. So if I were to write out all my sort of parts of my app like this, that would be like really hard to read because the number of lines of code in one file is going to be a lot. So you'll have to keep scrolling down and down in order to see anything useful. So one thing that React helps you do is sort of abstract this away. Now, what abstraction means is you hide something that's kind of complicated to look at somewhere else where you don't have to worry about it. And you create some sort of abstraction on top of it, and that's the thing you work with. And so that helps reduce your mental load and helps like with other things too. Like it makes parts of your app reusable and just like easier to reason about. So what I mean by that is, what if we could take all this stuff here and sort of get rid of it and instead just have this nav bar? How would we do that? Like, how would we make something like a nav bar? So we're going to go into that now. But before I move on, what questions do you have? Cool. So the way we create something like a nav bar is we create a separate file for it. So here, if you go into the components folder and then you go into navbar.js, what we've done is we've created a separate file for the nav bar. And so, yeah, maybe like some of this syntax here on line 1 to 3 is a bit confusing, and maybe line 22 is a bit confusing. But if you sort of look between 5 and 18, it's kind of the same thing that we were writing earlier in app.js. So really nothing's changed. We've just put it into a different file. So here also I've got this div which says display, like flex, justify content. Like it has a similar styling. And then it also has like all these other tags like CID workshop ideas and stuff. So we've just taken all the stuff that we wanted to write in our nav bar and we've put it like into a separate file instead. So this is like an example of a component. So a component is something that sort of has HTML that you put in a different file, but then what you can do is you can import it like so in your app, and then you can use it as if it was a normal HTML tag. So that's an example of a React component. So what questions do you have on components? So maybe as an exercise, what we can do is like start playing around with this particular component, this nav bar. So maybe you can try editing out this stuff like workshop, and you'll see that the nav bar in your main app changes. So it still says nav bar out here, but because all of the functionality is inside the separate nav bar file, we'll just like change stuff here and it'll show up in the main app. And so you could do other things too, like maybe you could set the color of your text to be maybe red. Also note that if you're editing style, you'll need a comma after every property. So justify content space between, comma, color red. And so what we can do here is maybe like start by writing our own component. It's not that bad. Like all we need to do is say we've got this welcome text here. Right. And what we want to do is put that into its own component. The first thing we do is go into our components folder and we create a file and we can call it welcome.js. The only important thing here is it needs to end with JS, right? And there's a bit of boilerplate here, which we can just copy from our navbar. So we can take this first line, import React from React. We can take this next line, fonts, navbar, whatever. We can take the bottom line, this guy, and then this export default line. So, and then just change navbar to welcome. And so now what we've done is we've created our React component and you can hit save, right? But this component doesn't really do anything, like it doesn't have that same text. So how can we bring this stuff into its own dedicated component? Well, we start off by just copying like the thing we want to put into that component. So like this. But you need to take whatever HTML you have and just prepend or like have a prefix return. That's it. So now we have our finished, like ready to go welcome component. Now that we have this component, how can we use it? So note that you can't really see it in the app anymore. Why is that? Well, that's because we didn't import it. So at the top of your file, just import welcome from wherever it is. So it's in component/welcome. But we've imported it, but we've still not used it in our app. So now we're going to use it and we can put it anywhere we want. We can put it underneath navbar. We can put it underneath like above it too. So wherever you want. And you might have a syntax error if you don't sort of put in a / at the end. So in this way, we took like whatever custom sort of HTML we were writing. So we might have something really complicated in the middle like so. And what we did is we took all of this stuff and we put it into its own component called welcome. And so this has made our app kind of simpler and less cluttered because now welcome can be edited in any way you want. You can add as much stuff as you want in here. You can add tags and tags inside of that and so on and so forth. And by doing that, you never like increase the amount of code that you need to look at a first glance. So every time you can change the welcome tag in its or the welcome component and the changes will be reflected in your main app. So what questions do you have on components, or have you maybe give me a thumbs up if you've been able to follow along so far? I'm also able to go back or sort of spend more time on things. Cool. So we've learned how to create our own components, but it would be kind of cool, like if we could sort of not have to write the same kind of component every time. So what I mean by this is here you see I have an H spacer. See what happens when you remove that. Like try deleting it and pressing save. You see that the spacing between this part and this part got reduced. So let me show you what I mean. Let me put in 2 spacers. Let me put in 3. Let me put in 4. And so you can see like the spacing has increased dramatically. Instead of putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spacers, I could just put in 1 spacer of a really big size. So I can edit the size here. So now I've made it a size 1000 and the rest of the content is all the way down here. So this is another thing that React lets you do, which is pretty cool, which is that you can specify or like you can pass in sort of properties that you want your component to have. So the h spacer in this case is nothing more than a simple div tag, right? So how would you create a spacer in just regular HTML world? You just create an empty div and you give it a height. So maybe you'd say that it's got a style with height and maybe like 200 or so, right? So this is how you could create different sort of sizes of spacing. So here's a 600 height and it's all the way down here. So, but still this is kind of wordy. So how can we reduce this clutter on our screen? We can create a custom component for that. And in that case, in this case, what we're doing is creating an h spacer. So let's look into the implementation of h spacer a bit more and see how it works. If I go in here, it's really simple. It's actually like an even more streamlined version of what we had in our welcome, but we can replicate it just by using this in case it's confusing. Let me sort of comment this out. You can call it h spacer just as before. And instead of returning that heading, you can just return a div. And you can have a style, same as before. And you can have a height, like 200 or so. But we don't want this height to be fixed. We want this height to be sort of dependent on whatever app says it should be, like size 100, size 20. So how can we do that? Well, we can just specify like the stuff that we want within curly braces in these like parentheses. So we've got parentheses, but then we can put in curly braces and we can just have like height or size. Whoops. And so whatever this size is, like whatever people are passing in as size here is going to be the size here. And we can set that as the height instead. So if you've ever programmed before and you've seen stuff like functions in JavaScript or like functions in C or Python, you know how a function takes in any kind of like argument or input? So this is a very similar idea here where you can pass in some sort of argument or input to a function and the function is sort of using that. Thumbs up if you've been able to sort of reason about this h spacer, or if you're able to understand what these arguments are that you can pass to React components. Sweet. So these arguments, by the way, in React world are called props. You can call them arguments, you can call them inputs, you can call them props. It's pretty much interchangeable. All right, so now we have that. I'm going to reduce the sizing of the spacer back to 20. So we can also look into the implementation of header, but it's not super interesting. It's kind of similar to what we've seen before. I just have like a H2, like heading, have a cool idea for a workshop, and have an H3 as well. Submitted here. So we can close out of all of these. So we've seen all this stuff, which is mostly presentational. So now how can we get to the good stuff, which is this interactive part, like that I keep promising? And here, what we can do is sort of jump into it and go into controls and kind of see the lay of the land and how it's working. And ignore for a moment what title, set description, set description, all that stuff is, right? Although you can now know that just like here where we had size, which is a number that you could pass in, you can also pass in all these things too as arguments or props to controls component. But what we'll do is click controls and sort of see how that works. So in this case too, controls is a React component and it has a bunch of HTML inside of it. So already, like if you imagine that we didn't have a separate component for this, but instead we just like copy pasted this whole thing and put it in an app, it would make stuff really messy. So we can already sort of see that React saves us a lot of like mental effort just by like reducing this clutter and putting it into a different file. But I've already said this a couple of times, so I won't sort of keep hammering that in. So let's look into controls.js and see what it's doing. So first we have this sort of container div, which is fine. It's just like regular HTML. And then we've got our workshop title. But now things start getting a bit interesting. You have these inputs, and inputs aren't unique to React. You see them in HTML all the time, but inputs are a way that you can get text in from a user. So text areas, inputs like buttons. These are all the ways that people can interact with your React app or JavaScript app. So in this case, the first input I have is an Adobe, this one that says Adobe XD Workshop, but it's the input for the title of the workshop. Right? So the type of this input is text, because people are just going to be typing plain text into it. It's got some styling, but that doesn't really matter. It's got a placeholder, which is what it says by default. But the interesting thing is this line, which says on blur. Now, what on blur means is every time someone writes into it, but then click out of the input. So you see that the input currently has focus. It's kind of black. But when you click out of it, it turns gray. That means people have finished typing. So when you click out of it, it blurs. That's what on blur means. So on blur is some sort of like event that you can sort of listen to. So what we're saying here is whenever the input blurs, on blur, run this function, right? Or run this piece of logic in JavaScript. So on blur, use set title, and we'll come to what set title is. But it's suppose that we have not like all this like all these variables stored somewhere, and what we're doing is just like updating our global variables. So what we're doing is setting our title somewhere, and we'll see where title is, but we'll come to that in a second. So just set title, whatever the value of that input is. So on blur, set title this, right? Similarly, we have text area, this guy here, where you tell us more. And on blur, set description, whatever the value of that text area is. Similarly, when you go into the input, on blur, set the image to be whatever the value of that input is. So this is a way that you can have some sort of like interactivity by every time there's an input and every time that input changes, you can just update some sort of global variable and keep that data safe and sound somewhere until you need it. So any questions so far? Cool. So now let's go into where this set title, set description, set image stuff is coming from. If you go back to app.js, you'll see that we put it right here at the top. So in our app, we have these special variables like title, description, image, and we also have a way to modify those variables. So like set title, set description, set image. So this syntax might be a little confusing, but just think of it this way. Like on the left, we have title, which is like what it actually is. And then on the right, we have a way to set it. So that's like a kind of function that can help you change title. Similarly, on the left, we have description, which is like some string text. And on the right, we've got a function to help you modify that string text. Similarly, image is a string. Set image is a function to update that string. So these are 6 variables that we just passed in as properties to controls, the same way we passed in a number to 8spacer. So we passed in those 6 variables here. Title, set title, description, set description, image, set image. And we'll get to onSubmit in a bit. So we have all that stuff coming in and being passed into controls, which is just like a function. And then what controls is doing is taking those inputs and using that. So we're setting the title, or we're modifying this title here every time someone clicks this input. We're modifying the description every time someone clicks this text area. We're modifying this image every time someone clicks this and writes into this image input. So that's where all our info is stored now. So notice how like in React, we have a place to store our data or our variables, just like you would in Python or C, but we also have a place to render that data in our HTML. So React is kind of blending like the functionality side of things, like the programming part, and it's blending that with the HTML, the rendering part. That's kind of what makes it so powerful. So before I move on, what questions do you have? Thumbs up if you've been able to follow along so far, or if you're getting any sort of errors, let me know and we can debug. Cool. So the last piece of the puzzle then is our onSubmit. So now that you've written all this stuff, how can you sort of show it down here? That's the question. So let's see what onSubmit does. OnSubmit is a function that we're passing in here. And all that's doing is, we can sort of maximize this. It's creating this sort of array of workshops. So an array is just like a list of things. And what it's doing is adding a new sort of item to that. So what's the new item composed of? It's composed of the title that we already have from here, that we know is up to date because we just said it. It also has a description, it also has an image, and it also has a time, which is automatically generated. And so with that, it's able to set workshops, which is another variable that we have. So in React, everything sort of follows the same pattern. You create variables, so you create like variables this way, and then you get what that variable actually is, and you get a function to update that variable. That's it. You can't really do stuff like title is now this. That's not really allowed in React, but what you can do is set title this. So you can update stuff this way. So all onSubmit is doing is just a function that sort of goes, takes everything that's here, whatever is here, and we know that all this stuff gets changed by our inputs, and it takes that and it just sets our workshops. Cool. So our workshops is just an array of this stuff. So what we can actually do now is see what that looks like. So anywhere in your code, what you can do is just type in console.log, and this is just like a print statement in JavaScript, and just console.log workshops. And so if you go out to the browser and you just hit this console button right here, you'll see what that means. So right now, there's no workshops in there. But the moment you type in some sort of title, some sort of description, and you hit submit, you'll see that there's one item in that array of workshops, and we can see what that item looks like. So it just has like 4 key value pairs, like 4 pieces of data in each workshop: the title, the description that we entered, the image, which is blank, and the time. And time has its own sort of representation as a string of numbers. And so every time we hit this, like every time we sort of add in more stuff and hit submit over and over, you see that this object just gets more and more things inside of it too. So I'm going to hit submit. And now there are 2 things in our array of workshops. So what we have here is some controls, and we have a way to submit whatever gets entered into those controls, and then it updates just our workshops variable. And that workshops variable, the next thing we're going to do is take whatever's in that workshops variable. And the last piece of the puzzle is, okay, now we have all this data in this array, like these 2 sort of workshops, but how can we sort of show them on the screen? So that's what we're going to cover next. But any questions so far? Thumbs up if you were able to console log what workshops are and what workshops is, and are able to sort of see the output in your console. Great, thanks, Joshua. So the next thing we want to do is sort of take all this like workshop data that we have and sort of just turn that into those nice cards that we saw. And the way we're going to do that is by sort of going through each of those items, so each of these 1 and 2, and creating a card for each. So one thing we could do is just create a card like this. And this is how you might do it like in normal HTML and CSS, where you can take like your workshops variable and take the 0th element, like the first element in there, right? And maybe sort of access its title and then put that in h1 tag. So you can do it like this. So that's our first workshop. And then you can create another div like this. And you can do that for the first workshop we have in there. So those are 2 workshops we submitted. I could create a new workshop like Adobe XD workshop, right? Learn XD and submit that, right? So now we have 3 and just hit save. But now what we have to do is sort of make a new card all over again, or make a new sort of div for this stuff too. So now we do 0, 1, and the second workshop, and now we have Adobe XD workshop too. So for programming languages that are 0 index, you start at 0, then 1, and then 2. So that's all great, but we want to avoid this repetition. Like we ideally want to create like a component to show the workshop's information. And we have all this stuff in an array, like all this data in an array. How can we map this data through what we see on the screen, like cards? And luckily there is a function to do just that, which is .map. So instead of writing workshop 0.title, workshops 1.title, workshops 2.title, what we can do is just go delete all of this and just say, oh, take all your workshops and then map them so that each workshop, and you can sort of say like each workshop, you can call it W if you like, and just gives you like a div. And in that div, you can put in workshops 0.title, for instance. And so now not 0, but just that W. And so what we're doing here is like a for loop, and we're taking each of those workshops in that array and just accessing its properties. It's like workshop.title, workshop.time, so on and so forth. So in a similar way, we could, instead of just showing the title, we could show all the properties. We could show the description too. And you'll see that I'm doing it with these curly braces right here. So that's a way for us to sort of write this JavaScript code while mixing it in with our HTML too. So now we have everything in a loop. And we've avoided repetition. So instead of writing workshop 0s, 1, and 2, we've just put stuff in a loop here. So that's what's basically happening behind the scenes in this piece of code. So if I bring back that piece of code here, that's basically what it's doing. Where we have this sort of card component, and we can go into more of what the card component is, but it's basically just a collection of like headings and paragraphs that sort of I don't want to replicate over and over again. So I just put them in a map and loop through them instead. And so I can refresh the page here, and you can see it on the right. And we can go into like what the card looks like too, just in case. But again, it's just HTML. So all I took was that HTML that I was writing earlier, and I created a fancier version of it and put it in the card file. But this is basically like the section of how this app works. Now, there's a few things that you can try. So for instance, what you can do is try and create your own components. Try and modify the implementation of a particular component like hspacer. Like maybe you can make other things too. Maybe you can modify its style so that it has a color, which is like a background color, which is red maybe. And so there are lots of things that you can play with here. And you can, one of the big things you can do is modify what the card looks like too. So in this case, if I'm just gonna save this, but you can see that they're pretty straight corners, so you can modify the styling here too. You can give everything a border radius, maybe of 20 or so, and so you can play around with the card styling. But notice how you've saved a lot of time just by modifying the styling in one place, like a card, one card. Here, you're sort of just running through a loop and creating cards for each of the data items. So you've avoided a lot of repetition by just using one component over and over again. So we're nearly done going through this, but before I move on to that final piece, what questions do you have? Cool. So the last thing I wanted to show is that there's React is basically very similar to like any sort of other HTML, CSS implementation, right? So you can have styling, but you can also have classes. So just like HTML, CSS, you could put a class name out here and then just call it whatever you want, like hello. And so what you could do next is just create a CSS file like antonio.css and sort of reference the class name here. So we can do this here and we can see like an awesome like style that Antonio's created for us. And the way to sort of import that would just be to import quotes, and then you can just do antonio.css / antonio.css. And you can see the look of your app changes dramatically. This was super cool.
If you open it in a new window, you can see the whole thing sort of.
Yep. There you go.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you've created something really cool. And the only thing that you really need to change in this case was like CSS, because React is giving you the same sort of power of HTML where you can attach like CSS to different class names and different tags. And the interactive part is sort of still intact. And that really didn't need no change.
It was awesome.
But yeah, that's pretty much it, everyone. Yeah, thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around and you can let me know.
We'll send the recording along to everybody as well.
Sweet.
Great job, Sam. This is fantastic. Thank you for leading this workshop.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sarim.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Good stuff. I'm gonna hit
Sweet.
stop record.
We can stop the recording now.